Welcome back to part 2 of my Marianne Faithfull video series. We last left the story where Marianne had recorded some tracks in 1967, released an album called Love in a Mist, and this would be her last batch of recordings for quite some time as she got involved heavily with the Rolling Stones. And if you get heavily involved with the Rolling Stones at this time, you might be in for a little bit of trouble, which is what happened to Marianne with the bust at Redlands. Now, this was the drug bust of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in early 1967. And let me give you some background here, because this bust there was things leading up to this bust, specifically the authorities and the establishment. They were having a problem with some of the pop stars that were proclaiming the virtues of recreational drug use. LSD had come into the scene, people were smoking cannabis, and pop stars started talking about it openly. To counteract that, Donovan was the first notable rock star busted, and this was in 1966, and he was busted for cannabis possession. Prior to that, Ian McLagan had been busted of the Small Faces for some marijuana as well. So the Rolling Stones were next on the list, partly because Brian Jones was actually quite open about some of this. And there was something that happened in early 1967 where the News of the World reported that Mick Jagger had been bragging about drug taking and had some cannabis with him at this club. And a reporter happened to be there eavesdropping on the whole thing, and they reported it. The problem was that that wasn't Mick Jagger that was there. It was Brian Jones. He was the one shooting his mouth off. Mick Jagger had an alibi. He was not even in town at that time. So a writ of libel was issued, and this made the world of the news. It was an embarrassing situation for them. And the Stones made it pretty well known, and the establishment had a good laugh at their expense. Now that's the setup for this Redlands bust, because this was going to be a payback. They were going to get the Stones. The day that this happened was going to be Mick Jagger's first experience with acid. And they took this day trip to the beach, wonderful frolicking day of fun, and they retired at Keith Richards' house to come down and just relax a little bit. And at this party, Robert Fraser, the art dealer, was there, Michael Cooper, the photographer, Tony Bramwell, associate of the Beatles, George and Patty Harrison, and David Schneiderman. Now, Schneiderman was an American who had brought the acid, and he is alleged to have been the one that set this up and worked with the cops to make this bust happen. So in the evening, the bust did take place. The cops basically stormed in. They were relaxing at the time, and Marianne Faithfull was having a bath. So what happened was Mick Jagger was accused of having amphetamine in one of his jacket pockets. Robert Fraser had heroin on him. He was a user. And though the Stones, these guys were not busted at the time, charges were later brought. The charge against Keith Richards is that he was allowing cannabis to be smoked at his residence. Now, the amphetamine that was in Mick Jagger's pocket was actually Marianne Faithfull's, but he gallantly admitted they were his to spare her. The aftermath of this incident really did two things. Number one, where the Rolling Stones were concerned, it made them, this is the point where they became a very powerful band. Up until this point, the Rolling Stones were just one of many other British bands like the Kinks or the Moody Blues or the Animals. They weren't really head and shoulders above those others yet. Obviously the Beatles were way up there. But because of this bust and because of the street cred that they got from the bust, really heightened their visibility. Some internal problems began here with the Stones as well, because Jagger was really getting upset with Brian Jones. If it hadn't been for Jones shooting his mouth off, this may never have happened. But as it turned out, the Stones ended up capitalizing on this in a very big way. Marianne Faithfull, not so much. She was the naked girl in the rug that the police reported on, and this changed her image from this virginal convent girl to this sexual object and essentially like a slut. This image of the bad boy of the Stones totally enhanced their image, but her image really became the sexual object that was supposedly the object of these rock stars' orgies and things like that. And the press did very little to dissuade that opinion. So she had a lot of hassle to deal with because of this. And as she said, this was the end of swing in London, and drugs replaced the scene. So this incident, Marianne said, she said, it destroyed me, and she really gave up pop music completely. This is when the Stones entered their very powerful stage. They started to get really popular, sell a lot of records, and they were doing this without touring. Brian Jones was in bad shape. The drug bust that he incurred earlier kept them from touring. Basically, the Stones just went back into the studio and started recording. Now, one of the things that Marianne was influential in was the song Sympathy for the Devil. Now, that was inspired by the book The Master and the Margarita, which she had given to Mick Jagger. So she was still very involved in the recordings and some of the writing. Now, at this time, as the drugs, you can imagine, well, maybe you can't, Keith Richards at this time was getting into harder drugs. Anita Pallenberg was always on acid, or they started doing cocaine. Marijuana was common. And Pallenberg and Marianne Faithfull hung out a lot together. As the guys were recording, they would be back at their place doing drugs, essentially. The addiction to cocaine for Marianne Faithfull happened at this time. She became pregnant with Mick Jagger's baby, but couldn't carry the baby to term. She didn't want to do any recording anymore, so she turned to acting. And one of the roles she took was Ophelia in Hamlet, and turned in some very good performances, though she was starting to use heroin. Sometimes she did so many drugs she couldn't work, and she was sick, or she was just unable to do the performance. Some of the drugs actually enhanced her performances. Mick Jagger was not as involved in the drugs, so there was a little bit of a disconnect now between him and Marianne, I think because of that. Now, in late '68, Marianne had started to write her probably most famous song, and this was Sister Morphine. Now, Mick Jagger had a melody, or he was strumming on the guitar and had this song, and she wrote the words. Now, this was actually a song about a man who had a terrible accident and is dying and was begging the nurse for morphine. So this was not a song about her. It was not an autobiographical song, as some people thought it was. And it really wasn't a pro-drug song, it was an anti-drug song. But this song got recorded, and along with another song called Something Better, she performed this at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. That was Something Better was the A-side. And this was released as a single, but it was withdrawn after just a couple of days.
Say, hey, have you heard the whiskey's the rage? I'll send you a jug in the morning. Tell me, Sister Morphine, when I...
Okay, we're in 1969 now, and things with the Stones were, well, they're always a little bit rocky with the Stones. Brian Jones got kicked out of the band at this point. Brian was a mess, and she knew it, but she was a mess. It wasn't long after this that Mick Jagger and Marianne went to Australia to be in the film Ned Kelly, which Mick Jagger was starring in. Marianne Faithfull was supposed to have a small role in it, but what happened was she tried to commit suicide by taking 150 sleeping pills. Mick Jagger found her and got her to the hospital in time. She spent 6 days in a coma, and the experience she went through while she was in a coma was a very strange visit from Brian Jones. And she thought she had died, and that Brian, who had died just 6 days earlier, she thought that he had visited her and asked her to come to the other side with him. And very strange story, and she goes into it in great detail in her biography. And anyway, she was nursed back to health, and but her and Jagger were having problems at this time, and Jagger was in the hospital with her, and the lyrics for Wild Horses came at this time. It's been reported that he had said, you know, wild horses can't drag me away. So things were really going bad at this time. You know, the loss of their baby weighed heavy on Jagger. He wanted to have a family. Marianne felt guilty about it. And making matters worse, she lost custody of her son Nicholas at this time. And she really wasn't fit to be his mother, to have custody of him. So all of this was just an absolute mess. And Marianne, I think, felt like that if she stayed with the Stones, she would die. But really, I think in reading her book, I think that she wanted to punish Mick Jagger somewhat as well. And she had this thing about her that she would leave men before they would leave her. So she really was struggling with this, and she did leave him. So here's what she said in her biography. She left him in May of 1970. She said, "I loved Mick very much, and it took me a long, long time to get over it, and I think it had a lot to do with my drug addiction. Though my drug addiction started when we were still together, it got very bad when I walked out on him." She mentioned in this book that she wanted to destroy herself to hurt Mick. So, you know, not a good scenario here. And at this point, an album was released, a greatest hits album. She had no new material. The song Sister Morphine and Something Better was not even released on here. This is a copy of, I believe, what was released in Europe. Same track listing, just a slightly different color, different cover. So when she left Mick Jagger, she became a full-time junkie, basically living on the street. There was this bombed out section of an area of town. She called it sitting on her wall. You know, she moved in with her mother, and she would spend time on the street for a while, then go home and get cleaned up. And there was always some people taking care of her. And she never had to resort to prostitution, but she was a junkie. Later in that year, sometime, Mike Leander, who was her first producer on As Tears Go By, contacted her and said, "Well, let's do an album." So she was put up in a hotel, and she recorded this album called Rich Kid Blues. This is actually a new copy, and she recorded this album, and she was really in bad shape. And she does not like this album. It's taken her many, many years to actually be okay with this album because she was in such bad shape. A couple songs on here, I'm not going to go into too much of this, but she did a few Dylan songs on here. She does a pretty interesting cover of Visions of Johanna. Also a song by Terry Reid called Rich Kid Blues, which is the title track. For my money, the great song on here is the George Harrison song Beware of Darkness, which is just a killer cover.
They just want to grow and grow. Beware of darkness and these visions of Johanna that conquer mama. That's why I think I got a rich kid's blues.
So this album that was recorded and finished was not released. I assume because it wasn't good enough for release. It saw release much later. One of the things I mentioned earlier, that she had inspired several songs. Let me give you a list of some of the songs that were written about her. First one on the list here is And Your Bird Can Sing by the Beatles, Carrie Ann by the Hollies, She Smiled Sweetly by the Stones, The Wind Cries Mary by Jimi Hendrix. Now this song, Hendrix said he told her that he wrote it for her, but I think he was just trying to impress her. You Can't Always Get What You Want is about her. I had mentioned Wild Horses. I Got the Blues is also inspired by her. One of the more famous ones inspired by her is Angie, the 1973 #1 song by the Stones off of Goat's Head Soup. This is 3 years after the breakup, and Jagger is still somewhat pining for her, and he has admitted that that is somewhat about her. Another song is called My Marie by Gene Clark. So as you can see, she had quite an effect on people, and what a greatest hits that is that I just read there. This brings us up to July 1971, and Marianne is in Paris with her new guy, Jean de Breteuil, and this guy he fancied himself as kind of a heroin dealer to the stars, but he was kind of a small-time guy. And he knew Jim Morrison. And this was the night that Jim Morrison died, because this is the guy who supplied him the heroin. And he got back late that night on what I guess was the night of July 2nd into the 3rd. He said, "We got to get the hell out of here." So they fled to Morocco. So to evade any authorities, because he supplied him with a lethal dose. So that's according to Marianne's book here. I guess if you ally yourself with guys like that, death is sure to follow. But not long after that, here's what she had to say. "However hard I thought living with Mick was, the first couple of years without him were harder. I had no idea how much I had been protected by Mick. Then again, if I hadn't left him, I would never have found out what strength I had in myself." She finally got back into a little bit of performing, And she had a #1 song called Dream in My Dreams that was #1 in Ireland. And this was in 1976. And she started to go back on the road and work again. And this was a long slog back because her voice by this time had dropped an octave. The drug use and the punishment her body was taking lowered her voice. And then she worked on the follow-up album to that called Broken English. This is considered her masterpiece. And this came out at a time when new wave was happening, you know, punk was going on. This is kind of new wave rock. It gets called a punk album.
Twisted around for a whole fucking week. Why'd you do what you said? Why'd you let that trash?
So she says of this album that Broken English came out of nowhere. I thought it would be my last record and then I would die. I needed to say I am not a victim, this is who I am. So this won a Grammy for Best Female Rock Vocalist. And it seems to me that it's almost like she was living this horrible life as a junkie. She almost approached living that lifestyle with a romantic view of it in some ways. And she mentions that in her autobiography, and I keep referring to that. That's this book here. It was originally released in 1994, Faithfull, an Autobiography. Great read. I think that this hard life that she imposed upon herself was almost done for the purpose of being to finally speak as an artist on an album like this in this way. And these are very harsh songs, and her performances were always harsh. Her interpretations were harsh and in your face, and it was completely different than what she was doing in the 60s. But this became the new Marianne Faithfull. And she released after this a couple of albums that continued that type of songwriting and that type of music, that type of style. And it wasn't until 1985 when she finally had an experience where she essentially died again. And she realized that she wanted to live, that she took an overdose and she felt that she had died, and she realized at the very last moment that she wanted to live, and she came out of it. It took a little bit of time, but she finally went through a serious rehab and came out the other end clean, and had been clean ever since. She kicked it. So one of the things that I guess at this point, I didn't talk too much about her 70s career. I wanted to keep this more of focus on the 60s music, but her story is so interesting. And I'm going to put a link to this book in the description below, because this is a great autobiography. It talks, you get a lot about the swinging 60s and her trials through addiction in the 70s and early 80s. After her recovery, she continued to release music, she continued to perform, and she's actually got a spoken word album that is scheduled for release in spring of 2021. So she's still working, and it's an amazing story, and she really has a great following, and I'm really happy to bring this video to you because I just think she doesn't get the credit she deserves. So if you're interested in getting some of her music, some of these albums are getting very hard to get, but she's got a couple CD compilations that are very good. One is called Come and Stay With Me, the UK 45s, 1964 to 69, which is probably a good place to start. As I had mentioned, this biography has been reissued and reprinted a few times, so you might see this in a different cover. Her later works are very readily available. If you can get your hands on these albums, they are all very good, because some of these tracks are only found on the albums. Like they're mostly available on download as well, so you can find them. But I'd also like to thank one of my viewers who helped me with some of the information to prepare for this video. His name is Alan Smith, and he helped me with some chart activity of her singles and albums in the UK, information I didn't have and couldn't get my hands on. So thank you, Alan, for getting that to me. Much appreciated. And that is it for my Marianne Faithfull video. I hope you liked it, and there's more coming here on Pop Goes the 60s.
I drink and I take drugs. I love sex and I move around a lot. I had my first baby at 14.